Well, welcome everyone to this Trobe Asia event on human rights in China, co-hosted with Human Rights Watch. My name is James Leibold. I'm a professor in politics and Asian studies at La Trobe University, and I'm going to chair the event this evening in the place of La Trobe Asia's director, Beck Stratting, who is gallivanting across Europe as we speak, and you can follow her travels on Twitter and get very jealous of the warmth and the good food she's eating. I want to begin by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose unceded land we meet on tonight, and pay respect to their elders past and present, as well as extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders people here today. It's my great privilege to introduce the panelists. We really do have a star-studded cast here. Feel very delighted to welcome first Yao Wang, senior researcher on China for Human Rights Watch. Next to her, we've got Vicky Xu, how do I describe Vicky Xu? A former journalist with the New York Times and a policy analyst and now author. And then finally, last but not least, my colleague, Gerald Roche, who's a senior researcher at La Trobe with myself. So the format for tonight's event, we've got about an hour for our discussion. I'm going to start with around 40 minutes of directed questions to the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions here as well as online. And for those joining us online tonight, you need to send your questions via the Q&A function. I hope that means and makes sense to you, and not the chat function. And we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can in the time allotted. But let me start. I'm going to start with you, Yao, because you came the furthest to be here. So it's only right that I start with you. And, you know, Human Rights Watch has been tracking, you know, human rights conditions for I don't know how long. I'm sure Elaine or Sophie could tell me, decades, and are well known for really kind of trying to put a pulse on the situation, and do have a number of mechanisms where you evaluate that comparatively. I wonder if you could, just starting big picture, just give us a sense of the condition of human rights in China today. Is it at an all-time low point? Are there signs any signs of encouragement? I wonder what your take on that is.
First of all, thank you.
Oh, I got to pass that.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's my first time in Australia, and I vote Melbourne over Sydney. Well, I would say the human rights situation in China is the worst ever since the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. All aspects of human rights has deteriorated since President Xi Jinping came to power. You know, we all know the situation in Xinjiang. It's crimes against humanity is going on. 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are being detained in camps, and the ones who are not detained in camps are under heavy surveillance, and their religious, cultural rights have been taken away. And then it's in Hong Kong. The crackdown has been dramatic ever since the national security law passed over 2 years ago. And I would say, you know, even for us who work in the field of human rights, you know, we have always been quite pessimistic about the situation in China, but still we did not expect the bad things, that kind of level of bad things happening in Xinjiang. We did not expect Hong Kong's freedom deteriorated so quickly over the past 2 years. Then look at the situation in, you know, the mainland concerning Han people. The internet freedom issue is, you know, it's really bad. You know, I grew up in the, you know, in the 80s and 90s, and when I entered university, the Beijing Olympic 2008 Beijing Olympic was happening, and you know, at that time people were quite optimistic about, wow, the internet came, you know, we're going to learn things that the Chinese government censored, you know, we're going to find the truth about the CCP. Then look at today's internet. The government has not only, you know, controlled it, blocked the information it does not want people to see, it also did a great job in, propagate the message it wants people to see. So, in a way, look at how, look at the recent Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. People were very nationalistic about it. People, were in a way unhappy that the Chinese government didn't take drastic action to even shoot down the plane, right? You can see how successful the government's censorship and propaganda has been over the, past several years. Then, there's also the elimination of the civil society groups in terms of, jailing human rights activists, lawyers, then one good kind of good, what's the English word, like a bright spot, I would say, it's women's rights. There has been like a crackdown on women's rights activists, the harassment, the detention, also the censorship online. But the women are still fighting back. I mean, the Chinese internet has been very censored, but you still see the kind of robust discussions online. So, I would just end with this little bright spots.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm glad you did that. I mean, we don't want to make this such a depressing event, and I think it's a good point that there are some positive developments that we can look to. But certainly, if we go back and look the heyday in the pre-Olympic Beijing Olympic period, and kind of compare it to where we are today, it does look like we're in a deep downward spiral. Vicky, I might come to you. So over the last couple of years, you've been researching and writing about Xi Jinping's crackdown in Xinjiang, lead author of a very influential 2002 study, Uyghurs for Sale, as well as a 2001 study, Architecture of Repression. Wonder what kind of surprised you? I mean, you came into it, not as an expert on Xinjiang, but with a journalistic background. I wonder what surprised you the most of doing that kind of deep dive into what's happening in Xinjiang, and what sort of impact do you think those reports have been able to have? Pass this.
Thank you, James. Well, both Uyghurs for Sale and Architecture of Repression were efforts of teamwork, and that included James' guidance and help over years. What's most surprising for me, in my years researching Xinjiang as a journalist / researcher, are two things. The first is how complicit all of us are and could be in the Chinese Party state's crackdown on Uyghurs. So one of the report we were speaking of before, Uyghurs for Sale, talked about how Uyghurs are being forced to make things in China, to manufacture things in China. We know that a lot of them have been moved from camps to factories, and a lot of people are assigned to work in factories and compelled to do labor for very low pay and under very harsh conditions. And their labor goes into China's vast and complicated supply chains. And we found in our research, that we identified 83 global brands that are potentially, and to varying degrees, that they have evidence of forced labor exists in their supply chain. So that includes very well-known brands like Nike, Adidas, LG, Samsung, these household brands that we all use. So, you and I, we could all be using iPhone. We could all, I couldn't have gotten here without my iPhone. So where does that leave us? So that's one of the really surprising things for me. And the second one is how much the Uyghur crackdown, crisis, crimes against humanity, genocide, whatever you call it, how much that is not new. We read about it in the news, so we assume it's new, but it's not, because it resembles the Cultural Revolution. It resembles the previous crackdowns that's happened in China so much. But because of this wide understanding, since China opened up in the 80s, that China has changed and China is trying to become a part of the world, and capitalism, this assumption that capitalism will eventually transform China, will eventually help China become a more democratic society, a more open society. Because of this understanding, I think we forgot how the party state system has a tendency to purge, to start mass campaigns that don't make economic sense, that don't make political sense. And the Uyghur crisis, from our research of architecture of repression, we very much found that, there are people have to pledge allegiance. People are subject to very pervasive propaganda, and they have to participate in propaganda. One example is that they have to record videos of themselves pledging allegiance. Officials have to write articles essentially denouncing their Uyghur culture and heritage. So these aspects that are less talked about can actually be quite illuminating, and tell us, what's always been existing in the party state system, and what could be coming, which is campaign style governance that's even more widespread, that spreads beyond Xinjiang. And we can see a little bit of that in mainland China, other provinces already under COVID. China is still fighting COVID under the COVID zero policy. And the very kind of strict management of neighborhoods and the limitations to people's movements already reflect to a degree of, it resembles what's happening in Xinjiang. So yeah, those are the two most surprising aspects.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I've certainly started to think more carefully about what I buy, but it's often very hard. The other day we were going to get some new bed sheets. And I was thinking, okay, a lot of times they don't identify where they're even manufactured. So I thought, well, we'll get Egyptian cotton. But how do I know that Egyptian cotton actually comes from Egypt? It's just a brand. So these things are really hard in supply chains. I mean, mind-boggling complex. But I'd like to think that your work on Uyghurs for Sale really helped us to sort of hone in on some of those concerns and what consumers can do about it. Gerald, I come to you thinking, Yashua brought up the pre-Olympic period. In some of my research, thinking back in the 1950s, in some ways it was a heyday of ethnocultural rights in China. The party identified 56 different groups. In some regards, created autonomous regions. It empowered them to be masters of their own domain. It helped them write histories, languages. You've studied language rights for a long time, and when you kind of and researched in Qinghai and spent a lot of time in Qinghai working with the Tibetan communities there, I wonder, looking back over the big period, kind of what I was saying to Yao Chao, we had a real new low point for language rights and language activism. Again, is there any signs of hope that you can think of?
In terms of bright spots or thinking about hopeful developments on the horizon in terms of language rights in China, it's really hard to find anything very much to be encouraged by at the moment, particularly if we look at the official level in terms of policy and practice by the state. I guess there are a couple of encouraging community practices that we saw emerge, particularly during the pandemic, where communities were taking the initiatives themselves to produce translations of government health materials into their own languages. And that was really good, but it also highlights a problem in that they shouldn't have had to do that. They shouldn't have been in the place where they were reliant on their own resources and initiative to do that in the first place, because it should be an obligation of the state to provide that information to people in the languages that they best understand. So even in the areas where we can say that there are some bright spots of hope, what they really do is demonstrate activities in areas where the state is failing to meet its obligations anyway. So in terms of where we're at, in terms of language rights in China, I'd say it's probably the worst that it's ever been, but I would also say that it's always been extremely bad when it comes to the recognition of linguistic diversity being a particular problem. So a lot of the coverage that we read in the news and in reports about human rights in China and in academic press tends to focus on big languages, big minority languages like Tibetan, like Uyghur, like Mongolian. These languages are all recognized by the state. They're all acknowledged as existing, and they are given some limited role in public on signs, a little bit in education, etc. But all of that is being gradually suppressed. The real dark spots, if we think about the opposite of bright spots, the real dark spots in language rights in China is for the hundreds of languages that the state refuses to recognize as even existing and having any claims on any rights or freedoms whatsoever. So the Chinese constitution, for example, talks about minorities having the freedom to use and develop their own languages. But nowhere does it specify what those languages are, and so that's left up to discretionary mechanisms. And basically what happens then is that James mentioned this system of the 56 minorities. So the 56 minorities are each sort of unofficially appointed a designated single language, which means that in total, the state has to kind of manage 56 languages for 56 minorities. Across all of China, what we actually have is something like 300 languages, which every one of the 56 nationalities has more than one language. So that means that even when the state recognizes a single language for each of those 56 minorities, that suppresses all the other languages that they speak. And by suppress, I mean, it refuses to institutionalize them in things like education, healthcare, the media, communications with the government, and so on. I've studied this most extensively with the case of Tibetan. So the party state recognizes the Tibetan people as existing, which is good. They recognize that they have a language, which they model on the written Tibetan language, which no one actually speaks. But then Tibetan people actually speak a host of other languages. So beyond anything that you could reasonably describe as Tibetan, Tibetan people also speak about 30 other languages. And all of those languages completely suppressed, totally excluded from all public institutions, no capacity for them to even lobby the state to protest in relation to those languages because the state refuses to recognize that they exist. So that refusal to recognize diversity has been persistent since the founding of the PRC. So that's kind of like the background has never really changed. All we've seen in recent years, particularly under Xi Jinping, is an intensification on attacks on those large recognized languages like Tibetan, like Uyghur, like Mongolian. But those unrecognized languages, they're really the canary in the coal mine of what's going to happen to those bigger languages. And what we've seen is that the people who use those languages have responded to that suppression by shifting to other languages. So about half of the languages in China are being spoken by fewer and fewer people all the time because they're making a choice to respond to that suppression. And that's where these bigger languages like Tibetan, Mongolian, and Uyghur are also going to be headed.
Thanks, Gerald. A pretty grim picture there of linguistic diversity in China. Just a reminder to those online that you can send your questions in via the Q&A function. We've got a few. So now's your time to get your questions ready. I'm going to do another quick round of questions to the panels, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So I'll go back to you, Yacho, just wondering what your take is on the way China appears to be working the UN system. I mean, it's really been one of the foundations for the protection of universal human rights. But we've seen that eroded pretty significantly. And China's really tried pretty hard to not to abandon human rights, they still use the term, but rather redefine it. So I wonder if you could tell us, like, how are they redefining it, and how successful is that effort to redefine it globally?
As we're speaking right now, we at Human Rights Watch are eagerly waiting for the report by Michelle Bachelet, who is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the chief officer of human rights in the UN system. So she visited Xinjiang a couple of months ago, and we already didn't expect her to meeting, any Uyghurs, but then she met with Chinese officials. Then she, in her press conference speech, she parroted the Chinese government's narrative about Xinjiang. She said, "Oh, the commended the Chinese government's effort on counterterrorism activities. The Uyghur community and the human rights community were very disappointed or angry to see that kind of language spoken by the chief human rights officer at the UN system." So it really says, the encroachment by China in the system, how successful it is that it made the chief human rights officer in the UN to say what the Chinese government wants her to say. This is a clear example. Now we would want her to release the report. She's going to end her term by this month. By the end of this month, the report is still not out. We have no idea how the Chinese government is working on her within the system, but we see the effects of the Chinese government's work on her, right? So we still at this day, we hope that the report will have strong languages and are able to show the scale and the magnitude of the rights violations in Xinjiang. So we will see. That's a good example in terms of how the Chinese government is redefine what we know as human rights. In the Chinese government, in the Human Rights Council, it had successfully passed resolutions to promote an alternative version of human rights that emphasize on development, that undermines accountability, undermines what we know as civil and political rights. Basically, the government wants to say, your freedom of speech is not important. Freedom of speech shouldn't be an important part of the human rights. Economic development should be an important part of the rights. So, in a way, it has been able to push that kind of idea through the system. Beyond the system, I feel it has been quite successful in pushing ideas in developing countries. In Africa countries, the Chinese model is quite appealing to authoritarian leaders in Africa, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia. They feel, we want economic development as the way China, as what China has done, without giving people's right to speech, giving people's right to protests. And I have gone to different countries and talked to people in those countries, and I think especially the elite, I think they find the Chinese way of doing human rights is appealing. So in a way, I think it has been successful. But in the past several years, couple of years, I do see pushbacks from countries, whether it's from within the UN system or outside of the UN system. When countries, when China has rallied its friends in the UN, usually involves like countries like North Korea and Cuba and Pakistan to issue statements in support of China's, activities in Xinjiang. Then there's pushbacks from other governments, usually Western governments, and they issue joint statements to condemn the situation in Xinjiang. So we see more and more that kind of pushback, and also we see the independent experts in the UN system. They're called special rapporteur. Then they have those kind of experts have get together, and they have issued a strong joint statements condemn the situation outside the UN system. In Australia, I think what happened in the past 2 years, I think it has been quite encouraging that the government has taken more, I would say at least rhetorically speaking, has been speaking up recently, with regard to the detention of the Australian journalist Chen Lei. The foreign minister has shown statements about that, and also the Australian government had called. It was the first to call on the WHO investigation into the origin of the coronavirus. Then there was the push, like retaliation by the Chinese government, and Australia has weathered it well, So I hope to see more government pushback against China, and if governments do it together, it will be, effective.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the Bachelet report will be a real bellwether to, where the UN system is at with regards to human rights. Vicky, I'll turn to you. As you well know, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, has been increasingly assertive in limiting or silencing any international criticism of its policies, or what it perceives to be international criticism. We see that across the globe. We see it here in Australia. I wonder in what ways that occurs, and what, if anything, can be done about that. I mean, how all governments obviously want to promote their national interests. Does China do it in a way that is different from the way Australia does it, and how concerned should we be about that?
Thank you so much for the question, James. I think if I had to sum up the way that China or the Chinese government party state deals with criticism or any discussion at all, it is that if you want to discuss or have anything to do with China, you either toe the line or shut up. There doesn't seem to be a third choice. So a few examples, right? In terms, discussions on China, Australian politicians who have made comments on China that are deemed unfavorable. They, for example, Andrew Hastie and James Patterson, they're not given visas to go to China anymore. And more recently, Nancy Pelosi and her families have been sanctioned by China because of her visit to Taiwan. And during times when the Chinese government perceived the Australian government to be unfriendly or uncooperative, our Australian officials, they couldn't get their Chinese counterparts on the phone. So there's this kind of silent treatment, this kind of punishment to the Australian government. And then in terms of academia, I remember in 2019, when I was reporting for the New York Times, I was writing about self-censorship at universities. And this really bizarre thing happened. I would go around and interview academics who, not only study China, but they have anything to do with China. They would mention China. There would be IT professors, there would be agriculture professors. When I talked to them, they would say, yes, we realize that talking about China, and especially in an unfavorable way, could cost you your job. There was a accounting professor who was fired by Monash because of mentioning China in an unfavorable way. But the funny thing was that when I tried to get them on the record, when I tried to get anyone to talk about these experiences of censorship, be quoted in my article, they all declined. And that is the ultimate proof of self-censorship. And Human Rights Watch has also released a fantastic report on the dire condition on our campuses where, Australian students, including those from mainland China, have been harassed, intimidated, and silenced, and they do not have full rights to study and pursue, their intellectual development here in Australia. And then moving on to staying here in academia, China has issued multiple rounds of demands for Australia to rectify its behaviors in order to get the trades going again. And there was 14 demands, and one of those demands is for my former employer, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to cease to exist, basically, because we have written about China's human rights abuses. We have written about Uyghur forced labor. So again, it's, if you want to talk about China, that's fine. But if you're going to criticize it, then you shouldn't exist. So it's very much that China uses the same standards it does domestically. It applies the same standards to everybody in the world. And, outside of journalism, academia, government, I hope people remember when, our airlines like Qantas or Virgin, when they listed Taiwan and Hong Kong as countries, because travel-wise they are, because I can't, as a Chinese citizen, I would not be able to travel to Taiwan on my Chinese passport without a visa. So, but when airlines listed Taiwan and Hong Kong as countries, they were met with punitive measures by the Chinese government. So again, comply or shut up. And it's never been worse. How can we do about it? I would really like to expand on that because as an individual, as a journalist, I myself have faced persecution while I'm on shore in Australia. And I feel, I felt unsafe. I felt uneasy coming to this event, and I felt unsafe living in Australia. But this is not the case for a lot of my American counterparts like Yachel and a lot of journalists who live and work in America. And I think part of the reason, or that my counterparts tell me part of the reason, is because the US has taken very harsh measures. And, just 2 months ago, I think in July, the Department of Justice has just issued another indictment on 5 individuals in New York who have tried to attack and harass or intimidate China critiques. And so with, strong measures from officials, I think people who do work in the China field, who do research and do report on China and from, China, Australia, China-America relations, they have a better sense of safety. I think that's a good starting point to get the conversation going again, to get the discussion going again, like very basic physical safety.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, worth an applause. I mean, I think it's worth noting, our Chinese migrant communities, whether it be in Australia or in the US, are really in this double bind. One, under pressure to toe the party line, but also the anti-Asian racism that's really been stoked recently in the face of the deterioration of relations. So it's really important to kind of remember that and make sure that there's no one-to-one equation between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. Gerald, a question without notice, and I know you're up to it, because I know you've written about this, and I was thinking about it today. One of the common responses of Chinese government officials, as well as people in the Twitter sphere, about human rights abuses is this so-called whataboutism. What about the stolen generation of Australia? What about the high incarceration rates of African Americans in the US? My question to you is, like, how effective is that whataboutism? I mean, what do you make of it? But also the other side is, how effective is our attempts to call out China in terms of human rights abuse? Sometimes, it tends into kind of a bit of self-righteous chest beating. Is there other ways that you might think might be more effective?
Yeah, thanks for that. So let me see, what can I say about this? So it's a constant theme of anyone who has ever said anything critical about China on the internet, that you will be met immediately with this claim of what about? So for example, when I talk online about indigenous languages of China and the rates of language shift and the state-sponsored language oppression, etc., someone will simply turn around and say like, well, what about what's happening in Australia? And it's like, well, okay, that's fine, because Australia has an atrocious record on indigenous languages. And I've written about that. I've collaborated with indigenous scholars, but Twitter doesn't enable you to sort of bring your CV to the discussion, right? And so instead, what those what about claims do is they have a rhetorical function of just closing down the debate in its entirety. And so the problem with those claims is that, okay, first of all, they're logical fallacies, right? It doesn't matter logically if I live in a country that is eliminating its indigenous languages. That doesn't matter to the claim that your country is also doing that. It doesn't change it. But these debates aren't logical debates, they are political debates. And in political debates, things like legitimacy and morals matter. You need to have a moral leg to stand on. You need to be able to make legitimate claims, and it's hard to do that sometimes. So I think that has, like, it does have some important implications for how we advocate for human rights, the strategies that we use, and so on. I think it's good, and I would encourage everyone to continue just being openly critical. First of all, I think that that's important to do. But I think that we also need to think about other strategies that serve other purposes in terms of advancing human rights inside China. So, like, I think we do that primarily by setting good examples. And I think that that's really important. We set good examples of good human rights practice in our own countries. We advocate for justice and inclusion for marginalized people in our own countries. We raise our voice against racism and for indigenous causes in our own countries, because that demonstrates that that we care and that we are capable of being even-handed in our criticisms. But more importantly, so I think that a lot of human rights advocacy tends on trying to shift states' behaviors, that we want China to act in certain ways. We want them to stop doing this, etc. That's good, that's fine. We do need to do that. It's important to try and alter states' behavior. But China essentially is going to do what it wants, particularly in response to Australia's criticisms, right? We don't make much of a difference to them, I think. But what we can do is send very clear messages to people inside China who do know what's happening, and they do see what we are able to achieve in these contexts, right, in Australia. We give them good examples to look up to think, to help people imagine what's possible. I think that that is really important. And I think that that's important. That's based on conversations that I've had with, you know, contacts inside China who will be able to say things like, we saw blah, blah, blah on the news. We hope our day will come, right? And that's what it's about. It's about keeping alive that hope of people that their day will come, that things will change, and that they can change. And so I think that that aspect of providing positive examples as well as the negative critique, both of those things need to work together.
Super, thanks, Gerald. Well, I might open the floor for questions. I might start here in the room. This is your reward for trekking out in a cold Melbourne evening, but also online. Please keep the questions coming, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Yeah, so if you could raise your hand, and do we have Kate? Do we have a microphone? Another microphone? We got to use this one. Okay, so I might wander the floor off the first hand I saw come up. I'll go back here. And yeah, if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Robert Barwick from the Citizens Party. I got two questions for Vicky. The first is on the effectiveness of your Uyghurs for Sale report. Can you identify manufacturing companies that have stopped using Uyghur labour because of your report?
First of all, I would like to point out that last year during one of my trips to Melbourne to record Q&A, I ran into Robert at the airport, and in my opinion, I was ambushed, and he misrepresented our exchange on Twitter. And he accused me of wanting war with China. So I do not consider Robert to be here in good faith, and I refuse to answer his questions.
One other question from the floor. Over here, and then we'll try to deal with some of the online questions.
I'm Judith Amatolis. My role is just as a global politics teacher at Year 12 level. Just when I observe the mainstream media in Australia, on this topic of Xinjiang, I repeatedly see sort of rehashing of sort of the same sort of commentary, and it seems like things aren't even updated, like the number of people in incarceration and all of those sort of figures. And the other thing I barely ever see mention of the evidence of forced organ harvesting, or I hardly ever see mention of the incarceration of children or any speculation about what the Chinese Communist Party is aiming or what its plan is for those children in the next decade. And I'm just wondering how much self-censorship is going on in Australian media, and what can we do to confront this? It's almost like the media is sanitized. That's what it seems like to me.
Thank you for the question. Anyone want to start? Yeah.
Just to be clear, are we talking about Australian media on China or Australian media on Australia? On the China issue, especially Xinjiang. While I was working in newsrooms, I did notice and I did feel a lot of fear around reporting on China, especially Xinjiang. I'll give everyone an example. In 2018, the entire year, I was pushing really, really hard to write about the Uyghurs. But at the time, the international society was less aware of what's going on in Xinjiang, and there was very little appetite for writing about Xinjiang. So around June, I made my first reporting trip to Adelaide, where the most Uyghur Australians live. And I was able to, interview people and have an understanding of, how many relatives each family is missing. And when I came back with this reporting, my boss back then was apprehensive. They asked me, why would you spend your weekend on a trip to Adelaide to report on such a depressing issue? Are you Uyghur? Like, what's your problem? And then my next job, my new boss asked me to kill the story, basically, as a prerequisite to get a job at the different newsroom, because the second newsroom was scared of China and losing access to China. So inside of newsrooms, there's censorship. And then there's also that there's competing, like newsrooms and journalists are constantly competing for attention. And unfortunately, in the newsrooms, we look at the numbers, how many clicks each story gets. Unfortunately, the Uyghur stories or the organ harvesting stories don't get huge numbers usually. So newsrooms would make commercial choices when it comes to these matters. And then the last but not least, staff, if you want to report on China, if you want to report on organ harvesting, you need talent inside of newsrooms who can look into these issues, who can talk in Chinese with sources. But then these people are often come from mainland China, like me and Yaqiu. And, you know, we are vulnerable because we have hostages back home, we have loved ones and friends back home. So most mainland journalists from mainland China that I know tend to focus on, you know, technology or environment or culture, you know, not because they're not passionate about human rights. They can be very passionate about human rights, but not everyone can be so ruthless to their own family and friends back home to be fixated on human rights, like myself and Yaqiu, I guess. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Vicky. I might ask one of the online questions, question from Aston Kwok. He's asking about what universities can do to address the issue of academics feeling like they need to self-censor as it relates to China. So I know Human Rights Watch issued a code of conduct. So maybe I'll start with you, Yaqiu, and then I'll go to Gerald, who is an academic in a university, to get a sense of how pervasive you think the problem is and what could be done about it.
I think for students and for academics who feel, you know, they have to self-censor, I think first of all, universities needs to, you know, provide, you know, at least collect the information. I don't think university even at that level, like they're not, you know, the university I talked to, like they don't even aware, you know, there are this kind of harassment, intimidation of and the self-censorship that are going on. So make, you know, say that we are aware of this issue, we care about this issue. If you face that kind of a fear, you face real harassment, come to the leadership to talk about it. This is the first, right? Then, you know, I know, like, you know, there are certain, you know, I'm not an academic, but you have to go through certain process in order to, you know, interview people, or, you know, there are certain requirements for like a disclosure, and people worry about that. You know, I don't want to disclose my name by doing this paper. You know, their university needs to be cognizant of the particular kind of concern the study of China field has, and maybe, you know, say if you feel of fear of repercussion for being associated with this paper, you know, you can use you know, you can be an anonymous author. I don't know, you know, how exactly that should be carried out, but I think at least the university needs to have that kind of, you know, mindset that this isn't a serious issue. We need to come together and, you know, design strategies and processes to address it. You know, maybe, you know, academics who know the ins and outs, how it works, can speak on the specific.
Yeah, so I think that there's a bunch of things. I mean, there's a bunch of structural problems in the Australian tertiary education system, which contribute to this problem of censorship and self-censorship amongst academics. So, for example, one of the simple things that could be done across universities that would help academics speak more freely is job security, right? And allow people to have stable, ongoing jobs where they were able to continue doing their research, because people self-censor in order to maintain their careers. If their careers were secure, they wouldn't, that would be less of a concern. So I think there are really like simple prosaic things that they can do in that regards to protect their researchers. These problems extend out to the national level in the way that competitive funding is allocated from the government. Everyone is scrambling to get research funding from the Australian Research Council. That's driven by, you know, it's competitive system. You have to be productive. It's all decided on the national interest. It's got to pass the pub test. There have been examples of the education minister scuttling projects that focused on China because they didn't pass the pub test. The public wouldn't be interested in them. We need to roll that back as well, and we need to invest in research in China to improve understanding. And the third one I would say is like to stop treating international students and particularly Chinese students like cash cows. We've done that for 10, 15 years, right? With no concern whatsoever for the challenges that those students will face, the security issues that they will face, nothing to protect their freedom of speech in classrooms, right? Just imported them, profited from them, shipped them out again on this rotating basis for years and years and years, right? And so to stop exploiting Chinese students as an economic resource and to consider them as human beings with legitimate rights that the university has a responsibility to ensure would also be an important part of that, I think.
I want to see if there's another question here on the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the information. It's very interesting. Actually, I don't have a question. I would like to share some of my own opinion or observation. First, I used to be a cash cow. I graduated from MIT. I'm trying to do some cashing, but do some business after COVID. So I'd like to talk about, because tonight we focus on human rights, and my observation is because it's getting worse because the after Xi Jinping came to power and everything is like changing rapidly. And I think it's because there's like a tactic the government use that focus dominantly on the economic growth. So there's like a hunger game happening in China to be rich, you have a better life and so competitive. You go overseas to study and you come back some kind of like background, like see different part of the world. So when you focus so much on money and others, the feeling can be neglected and they have less sensible about what right they have. So they kind of don't think about that much, and because they focus on gaining money. And also I want to share about the language diversity you mentioned, that quite interesting. We used to like a decade ago, like 10 years ago, we have the discussion in China media, people worried about the distinction of language. It's not, they didn't refer to the Mongolian language, they refer to the dialect, because on TV it's all Mandarin and people, they're losing their own dialect when they speak. So you only can see it like stand-up comedian or drama, you can see language of people enjoy it. So we're losing that part in general of dialect and diversity language. But a good thing to see is with the internet, the government had the most, they spent a lot of effort to do the censorship. But they share videos like different lifestyle, like tourists traveling. So they go to Mongolia, go to Tibet, and probably they have more voice and can bring to the spotlight about what they need. Thank you. Sorry, too long.
No, thank you. That's a great comment. I wonder if I kind of turn that slightly into a question. I mean, Yaqiu, you're such a keen observer of the Chinese internet. I wonder what your thoughts are under Xi Jinping's efforts to censor it. I mean, we've all long said it's like a cat and mouse game. Has the cat won? Is there any hope for the mouse?
I think it has gone worse. I mean, I think the change is that there had been some censorship. Censorship has gone worse, right? So when I was a college student in China, like our fear of censorship is from the government. Government can remove your account, can suspend you. Some of them have gone to jail because of you say too much, right? On the internet, you criticize the government. Now people know they don't. they're not just worried about the government come after them. They are worried about other Chinese people come after them because of, if you criticize the government, if you are pro Hong Kong, you pro Taiwan, then other nationalistic online users are coming up to you. They would troll you, or they would do the human flash search. They try to find private information and they try to go after you. So now I think, the government has done such a good job in censorship and propaganda that it has its army of people who work for the government for free. So that's just the state of the situation. And also, when there's so much choice, if you're worried both by your your fellow countrymen and worried about the government, and people who are critical of the government, they no longer wanted to participate in the discussion. So when there's even fewer people who wanted to participate in the discussion, who wanted to express critical views, for the younger generation, they even have fewer people to learn from. Because when I was 20 years old, there were 40-year-old, 50-year-old, they were like very enthusiastic about telling me the stories I don't know, giving me the knowledge I don't know. Now a 20-year-old, they have nobody to talk to nobody to learn from.
Yeah, great observations. We're sort of out of time. I might one last question, if you don't mind just going slightly over. And
two cities, sorry, I'll say it again. I'm 80 years old. I've been an activist, a humanitarian, and I look to help disadvantaged people. I'm not political. I ask one question. Would you rather live in Washington or Beijing? Yeah.
I want to start with you, Yasha. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward question.
If I had a choice, I would prefer to live in Beijing.
You don't need to expand on that, but we can imagine.
That's such a good question. Would I live in Washington or Beijing? I think I would spend half of my time in each city if I could, but I cannot go to Beijing. Like, I think before the end of communist rule. So Washington.
I'm going to slightly dodge that question by saying I lived in China for 8 years. I lived in the city of Xining on the northeast Tibetan plateau in Qinghai province. A beautiful place where I enjoyed living and learning very much. I can no longer go back to China because of my research, because of my work. I am a threat to my friends and my former colleagues who are harassed because of the work that I do. If I could choose, I would definitely not live in Washington. I would definitely not live in Beijing. I've always hated both of those cities. I would return to Xining to live.
That's a good response. Mine would be, because I can't go to China either. And I did live in Beijing and the pollution was terrible. And no way would I want to live in the US, my home country. The guns would scare me senseless. So I think, how lucky are we that we live here in Australia, in Melbourne? So we'll end the discussion with that, and I feel very fortunate to be here in Melbourne with all you and with these fantastic panelists. So please, a round of applause for our great panelists, and thank you everyone online, and apologies online that I couldn't get to a lot of the questions and questions here in the audience. I'm sure the panelists will stay around for a little bit if you want to come up and have a chat, and otherwise we'll hopefully see you at another La Trobe Asia event in the future. Check out their website for upcoming events, and thank you very much.